Thank you very much indeed. Some thanks just to start off with. Thanks, obviously, to Bath for Europe for the invitation to come to Bath. It's one of my favourite cities in Europe. But also for their incredible hospitality. I've only arrived a few hours ago, and already I feel like I've been treated like royalty. Thanks also to the crowdfunders who have paid for us to be in this amazing venue as well. Not only is Bath a very beautiful city, but it's also really lovely to feel a sense of sort of civic pride and engagement among so many of the people who I've met already. And thank you as well to so many of you for coming here to listen, to participate in the discussion. And I've just heard some people traveling from quite a considerable distance. It's a real honor for me, and I'm going to try and repay your effort, your kindness, by offering, if nothing else, at least an informative session on this very important issue. Now, I'm going to talk for about 20 to 30 minutes. I've now grown used to saying that. I used to say I'll talk for 5 minutes, but it seems that 15 minutes is my absolute minimum. So if I say 20 to 30, it'll probably just be about right. And I'm going to outline really just some very brief key issues, because the main focus of this evening, I think, is going to be on questions and discussion. Now, just from the outset, it's probably useful for me to set some parameters and make 3 quick disclaimers. First of all, I'm not a member of any political party. I'm not a member of any political campaign. I have my own personal views. I have my own preferences, of course, but my job is to be a professional researcher. It's to gather, to evaluate evidence, to use my training, my skills, my experience, to offer critical analysis of legal issues. And often that means telling people, including often myself, things that they don't necessarily want to hear. Secondly, my skills, my knowledge, are those of a public constitutional lawyer. I'm not a political scientist, I'm not an economist, and so I have some of the advantages of a lawyer. I like rigor, I like looking at arguments from all sides, I like critical analysis, but I also have certain limitations. I won't necessarily make any empirical claims, I won't offer any economic forecasts, but I think that's probably less of a limitation and more of an advantage. And third quick disclaimer, even as a legal researcher, I suppose, but being a legal researcher doesn't necessarily mean that you know lots of law off the top of your head. It simply means that I know how to find the law as and when I need it and to work through it quickly and methodically. So if you do ask me a question and I feel that it's sort of outside my competence, if I feel that I just don't have the necessary detailed knowledge in my head, I'll apologize and I'll say so. And if I do venture an opinion, which is essentially that of an informed observer rather than a professional researcher, I'll make it clear that I'm doing that. Okay, lawyers' disclaimers out of the way. Let's begin then with the Prime Minister's announcement at the Conservative Party conference on the 2nd of October 2016 that the government does intend to formally notify the UK's intention to withdraw from the EU no later than the end of March 2017. Now, the date in itself isn't actually so surprising. It's roughly within the timescale that the Prime Minister had already indicated during the course of the summer of this year. Perhaps more significant in a way is the fact that the Prime Minister feels able to pin down a date at all, because I think there are 2 possible explanations for this. The first is that the government feels confident that the UK is prepared politically, bureaucratically, diplomatically to start the process of withdrawal, that they have some strong sense of what they want to get out of the negotiations with the EU, both in the short term and in the longer term, and they feel confident, for example, that the French and German elections won't derail seriously those plans, those objectives. If that is the explanation, then I think the government is much better prepared and much more confident than many of us ever thought it would be. The alternative explanation, of course, is that the government isn't necessarily terribly well prepared, that it doesn't have much of a clear idea of its negotiating objectives, its negotiating strategy, and rather that national policy is being driven by ideology, by people who want the UK to simply tumble out of the EU as quickly as possible and almost regardless of the consequences. And in that case, we have cause to be worried. Now, either way, upon notification, a whole range of issues will become even more pressing than they are today. Some are internal to the UK, they concern our own legal and constitutional system. Some are external to the UK, they concern our relations with the outside world. And what I'll do is just offer a very brief overview, a reminder of these main challenges. Internally, we have 3 main challenges. And the first is to prepare UK law and politics, as it were, for the process of withdrawal itself, without throwing our economy and many individual relationships into uncertainty and unpredictability. Remember that for over 40 years, UK law has evolved under the influence of and in combination with EU law. And we need to be careful that the very process of withdrawal itself doesn't create damaging legal vacuums, that bits of law just disappear, or undesirable legal certainty, that public authorities don't know whether their powers are still valid, that individuals don't know whether their relationships are still stable. Now, the government's solution to this challenge, this first challenge, is the Great Repeal Bill, which was announced again at the Conservative Party conference in Birmingham. And this Great Repeal Bill would do two things. First of all, it would formalise the UK's withdrawal from the EU as a matter of our own domestic constitutional law by repealing the European Communities Act 1972. But at the same time, they say, it would seek to incorporate the whole of EU law into the UK legal system, at least on an interim basis. It's a rather ironic name, the Great Repeal Bill, that is actually going to do an awful lot of incorporation. Now, this is a deceptively simple solution. It actually raises almost as many issues as it solves problems. It might be something we come back to in questions, but that's our first challenge. The process of withdrawal itself from the point of view of our own legal system. Second internal challenge is making substantive decisions into the future about what we do with all of this EU law that has been incorporated into the UK legal system. Which aspects of our EU legal heritage do we want to keep? Which aspects do we want to get rid of? And what do we want to replace it with, if anything? What do we want to reform? And if so, in what ways? And these questions very obviously involve fundamental policy choices which will affect every aspect of our national life. They're going to be played out not over a period of months or years, they're going to be played out over a period of decades. And most importantly, they're going to be played out without the safeguards which EU law imposes to prevent member states from deregulating, for example, the environment, workers' rights, consumer protection, and so on. And it's very clear that leaving the EU is as much about seeking to transform our own national legal and political system, and with it our own economy, our own society, as it is about actually leaving the EU. Third internal challenge then are about the relations between the constituent nations and regions within the UK itself. We know, obviously anyone who reads the news knows about the prospect of a second referendum in Scotland on independence. Perhaps less obvious would be the knock-on consequences of Scottish independence, especially for those of us living in the north of England, if the balance of power and representation within England itself shifts considerably towards the south. We know that there are potentially very significant, if not outright worrying problems around the situation in Northern Ireland, and let's not forget Wales, Gibraltar, and also a group of countries which aren't often mentioned, the UK's overseas countries and territories, places like the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, and the Falklands, which enjoy certain special legal rights and privileges through the UK's membership with the EU. All of those interests are going to be affected, potentially in far-reaching ways. So internally, a set of challenges. Externally, a set of challenges of at least equal scale and importance. And the first is the immediate challenge of negotiating a suitable withdrawal agreement with the rest of the EU within the rough indicative timescale of 2 years set down under the treaties. And this divorce settlement will have to deal with some fairly nitty-gritty issues such as budget, such as staffing, and of course the key question, what do we do with each other's migrants? The second external challenge is the separate, entirely separate, much longer, much more difficult process of negotiating a new relationship with the EU to govern our mutual relations into the future in fields such as trade, environmental cooperation, public safety, crime, security, defence, and so on. It's rather frustrating, I think, even still, to hear many of our political leaders and much of the media coverage of these issues simply conflate the withdrawal agreement with that future framework agreement as if they were still one and the same thing, because they aren't. They are separate things. They will be done sequentially, and particularly when it comes to the question of parliamentary control, parliamentary input into the whole process of withdrawal, there's a really unhelpful lack of clarity from the government about how they intend to involve Parliament. It seems to be done as if these two agreements were the same thing. They're not, they're separate. The third external challenge relates to certain key bilateral relationships between the UK and EU member states, but bilaterally rather than with the EU as a whole. Take Ireland, for example. What do we do with the common travel area? What do we do with the border between the Republic and Northern Ireland, particularly when it comes to the movement of people. Or France, what do we do? Will the French still feel willing to effectively police the UK's borders on French soil? We know that several of the potential candidates for the French presidency believe that the French shouldn't do that anymore. So there are important bilateral relationships which have to be addressed as well. And then the fourth and final external challenge, the small matter of rebuilding various aspects of our legal relationships with the rest of the world, bilaterally, multilaterally, through organizations such as the WTO. And that is, that final challenge, I think, is a particularly difficult one, because the UK doesn't actually have a trade policy which is capable of providing a rational, a coherent basis upon which to carry out such negotiations. Many people worry, for example, that we simply still lack the capacity, although the government has been seeking to recruit negotiators, we simply lack the capacity to do this in a very effective way. Many other people worry that those in charge of UK trade policy don't seem to have much of an understanding of what trade relations actually involve. They don't seem to grasp the incredibly laborious, technical, difficult issues which have to be dealt with in trade negotiations, but equally importantly, they don't seem to grasp that all trade relationships are about making crucially important decisions about your economy, about your society, and about the nature of the external obligations and disciplines that you take on through an international trade treaty. Now, all of these issues, the internal, the external, share two features in common. And the first is uncertainty and unpredictability. Now, people like me, constitutional lawyers, can use legal principles to help identify certain possibilities and certain parameters, what feels more likely, what feels less likely. But ultimately, there is an enormous amount of uncertainty here. But the second common feature is the interconnectedness of many of these issues, because how we address one of these challenges will influence quite crucially how we might address some of the others. For example, if we end up having a fairly close relationship with the EU into the future, that will help determine the future status of EU law within the UK, i.e. we'll just keep most of it as it is, and it'll also influence the type of constitutional settlement that we end up with between the nations and regions of the UK. But I suppose the key point here is that the vote to leave the EU was not just a vote to leave the EU. It's a process of really fundamentally transforming the entire orientation of the UK, both internally and externally. Now, any one of those issues could take up a whole evening of discussion, and I'm sure some of them will come up again in questions. But given the limited time, what I do is just focus on one particular question, and that's the general context of the forthcoming negotiations between the UK and the EU. And I'll look at this question from both sides, from both perspectives. And let's start off with the EU side. Now, the EU has made it clear the UK made this decision. The UK has to come forward with its proposals for what it's looking for into the future. Now, the EU won't remain a passive actor for long. Once we've given our notification, once we've set out what our views are, the EU will take up its natural role as the dominant side in these negotiations. And already we can identify three sets of limits to what the EU can or ever would offer the UK in the years to come. And let's call them legal limits, technical limits, and political limits. Now, the legal limits of what the EU can offer relate to the fact that the EU is an international organization. It only has the powers which are given to it under the treaties. It doesn't have any inherent power or sovereignty of its own. And so the EU simply can't offer the UK anything which doesn't exist under the treaties already. It has to follow the relevant decision-making procedures involving the relevant institutions, and it has to obey its own rules and principles, for example, the principle of limited powers or respect for fundamental rights. And that means, for example, that although we hear people suggest that maybe the UK could have an associate membership status, we'll not be full members, but we'll not be completely out, we could be associate members, there's no such thing. There's no such thing under EU law as associate membership status, so there's no point even asking for it. So there are legal limits to what the EU can offer. The second and very important category are technical limits to what the EU can offer. Participation in a whole range of EU policies and programs really presupposes that you're integrated, your national systems are integrated into a whole set of frameworks, of procedures, of institutions, of rules. And if you're not prepared to accept those frameworks, those procedures, those institutions, then you simply can't participate. No one's being nasty, no one's being vindictive. You need to be integrated into a system in order to participate in it. And if we're not prepared to do that, then we can't. Now, the most obvious situation where this applies is the single market. And it covers everything from food or toy safety through to financial services supervision, medicines and chemical regulation. The single market is built on a system of highly integrated cooperation through networks and regulation and processes. If we will not buy into that, we will not be part of it. But it's also true in other fields as well. For example, social security coordination, or European health card, or pension, cross-border pension payments, police cooperation, the European arrest warrant, and so on. So we have legal limits to what the EU can offer. We have technical limits to what the EU can offer. Thirdly, there are, of course, political limits to what the EU can offer as well. Now, many of the leading Leave campaigners speak as if only the UK has national interests, and only the UK, uniquely on the planet, has a right to defend them. Of course, every country has national interests, and every country is entitled to defend them. Welcome to the world of international relations, our government should be told. And that's true both individually for the member states as sovereign countries, but it's also true collectively for the member states acting through the EU. For example, individual member states will all bring their own national interests to these negotiations. And if Spain turns up and says, we are not going to cooperate with you unless we get joint sovereignty over Gibraltar, there's no point saying, oh, how unreasonable, how unfair. Spain has a national interest. Spain is entitled to defend it. Welcome to the world of international relations. The interests of each state might pull in very different directions. France may well feel that there's a strong imperative to secure close security and defence cooperation with the UK, but might be extremely happy to poach the City of London over to Paris. And of course, the interests of each individual member state will change over time. A 2-year negotiation means that we might see half the governments in the EU member states change through elections and so on. So it might well be that the negotiating table is changing constantly. The goalposts are always moving. Now, besides the interests of the individual member states, there's also a collective bottom line for the member states as a group of 27. And it's a very simple idea. The EU cannot offer the UK any better deal by leaving than we have by being full members. It's as simple as that. We cannot have a better deal by leaving than we have as full members. This isn't moralistic, it's not punitive, it's not some sort of evil empire. It's obvious, it's rational, it's in the interests of the member states and the EU as a whole. EU membership is all about making compromises. You basically go into the system knowing that you're going to get your way 90% of the time or 95% of the time, and 5 or 10% you have to give way on something as a compromise, because overall the benefits of membership outweigh any disadvantages. And the UK in particular, we should recall, had an extraordinarily good deal. We still have, I'm already speaking in the past tense, an extraordinarily good deal compared to other member states. We had a permanent derogation from ever adopting the single currency. We had special arrangements where we picked and chose which aspects of the area of freedom, security and justice that we wanted to participate in. We had special rebates on the budget. And most of all, it's very strange for someone like me who works in the field, the Treaty of Lisbon, which creates a whisper of hatred in certain venues in the UK. Let's not forget that the Treaty of Lisbon was widely seen across the rest of Europe as a triumph for the UK's vision of Europe, for the UK's vision of Europe as a collection of cooperating sovereign states. Everywhere else in Europe, the Treaty of Lisbon was seen as the UK's ultimate success. It was here that it was vilified as this sort of terrible deal. And yet we're still not happy. We still voted to leave. And so when it comes to the withdrawal and the future negotiations with the UK, the other member states simply can't afford to allow us to cherry pick, to allow us to somehow blackmail a better deal, because it would simply undermine one of the key principles that keeps the entire system functioning. And not just functioning for the 27 member states, also for some of their key external relationships, the European Economic Area Agreement with Norway, or the way that the EU handles Switzerland. They all depend on this basic principle that you get the best deal by membership, not by leaving. So much for the EU side. The EU is waiting for us, but it has a whole series of limits to what it can and will offer. What then about our negotiating position? Well, obviously, the position immediately after the referendum result in June was hardly very promising. There was an evident lack of any political vision for what the UK might want to achieve in its relationship with Europe. There was a clear lack of any proper bureaucratic or diplomatic preparations or even capacity to deal with the challenges ahead. There was a clear lack of proper understanding of the undoubtedly complex and ultimately contradictory motivations behind the Leave vote. And they've all contributed, we all know, to a sense of uncertainty, a sense of tension in trying to formulate a coherent national position. But the most worrying thing of all for me is that that void at the centre of national policy making appears to be filled by ideological considerations. And in particular, I think it's very striking that the Leave tactics that we saw before the referendum are the exact mirror image of the Leave tactics that we see since the referendum. Only now they're trying to control the nature of the UK's withdrawal and its future relationship with Europe, and unfortunately they're represented at the very highest levels of government. In a little video post shortly after the referendum result, I broke the Leave tactics pre-referendum down into four strands for the purposes of sort of rationalising them: misrepresenting reality, peddling fantasies, attacking any opposition, and undermining the quality of our national democracy. Let's just work through each of those four briefly and demonstrate how they are still alive and kicking today. First of all, misrepresenting reality. Remember, before the referendum we had all of the lies about sovereignty, about immigration, about European armies, about Turkish accession. Now, I think what's very striking and very difficult to deal with is the fact that Leave have established the dominant narrative in this whole process, and it's a dominant narrative which is built upon misrepresentations. For example, the vote to Leave was an overwhelming and decisive one. No, it wasn't. It was 52%. And 52% is not decisive or overwhelming. It's a marginal victory, actually. Another example, one which many of us in Liverpool, for example, find very difficult to swallow. The vote to Leave was effectively a revolution by the disenfranchised, by the working classes, by Northern England. No, it wasn't. In fact, all of the serious research which has been done so far suggests that the core, the backbone of the Leave vote, were middle-class, conservative voting people in towns and villages across England. This was not some sort of revolution by the disenfranchised or the working classes or by Northern England. This was a much more complicated vote, but its core was of middle-class conservative voters. Thirdly, the idea that the vote to Leave is anything other than a vote to leave. The idea that the vote to Leave somehow dictates or gives a mandate to do anything other than simply leave the EU. But it's now being used as a way to control the manner of us leaving, the types of relationships that we might forge. Very, very dishonest. And finally, unfortunately, probably the biggest of the lot, the idea that the vote to Leave was a rejection of the problems caused by EU migration. It wasn't. It was in part, insofar as we can identify what motivated millions of people to vote Leave at all, it was a swallowing of a lot of lies about the so-called problems caused by EU migration, because it is not an evidence-based assertion. It is one which is not really supported by reality. Now, the converse of this, I'm sorry to say, is to see how much of the opposition to Leave has taken up this dominant narrative. We've actually swallowed a lot of these messages and treated them as if they were the truth. And I think one of the real challenges for anybody who wants to counter the Leave dominance of our entire national debate is to challenge and reject some of these misrepresentations to get us started. Secondly, the second tactic, make false promises about the future. Now again, before the referendum, we can all remember the 350 million for the NHS. We can all remember, well, I certainly remember the promises that UK nationals living abroad had nothing to worry about. They'd be protected under the Vienna Convention. Which Vienna Convention? We don't know. Some Vienna Convention. But that has continued. That has continued after the referendum. Every time we hear one of the leading Leave campaigners say that the single market is just a slogan. It's a meaningless slogan. It's no different from things like the WTO agreement. They clearly are fantasizing about a world which doesn't exist. Every time a Leave campaigner tries to say that we can join the European Economic Area Agreement and effectively wreck it from within, because we're not content wrecking the EU one, we may as well do all the others as well. It's a fantasy. It's an absolute fantasy. And in some cases, this fantasy approaches something which is just utterly detached from reality. When we hear the idea that the UK will have successfully concluded a full round of global trade deals within the next 12 to 24 months, and you think, well, it's amazing. The rest of the world has been trying to do this for 60 years and not quite managed, but the UK, with no diplomats, is going to do it in 12 to 24 months. And just as an aside, it's usually not, someone should tell some of our ministers, it's usually not a good negotiating tactic to constantly insult your partners. Third of our Leave tactics. Anybody who dares to voice any form of dissent or criticism is savaged by the leading Leave campaigners. Now, again, before the referendum, let's recall that anyone who disagreed with the Leave narrative was biased. Everyone's biased, apart from Leave campaigners, of course, who weren't biased at all. I still receive God knows how many messages a week demanding, not just asking, demanding that I reveal how much Jean money I get from the European Union. Apparently, the figure of 0 seems very difficult to comprehend. But post the referendum, if anything, this has become even more dangerous and even more serious. For example, one of the things that should worry us all is the misappropriation of fundamental concepts which should be contested, are contested, but are being used as weapons to silence any opposition. Nigel Farage loves to declare the Leave vote as a victory for decent people, somehow implying that anyone who doesn't endorse leaving the European Union is not decent. We hear all the time that this was a victory for patriotism, as if somehow approving or supporting membership of the EU makes you unpatriotic towards your own country. But probably the worst example of the lot, democracy. Anybody who dares to criticize this vote is attacking democracy, as if democracy were a single concept that had no dissent and no differences of opinion. It's a very dangerous narrative. But the attacks don't stop there, because we're even preparing for future attacks. One of the things that I find quite worrying is the way that a narrative is being built that somehow the inevitable failure of these fantasies to manifest themselves in a successful reality will be the fault of the other member states. It's them who are blocking the UK from getting the wonderful deal that it really deserves. And equally, the idea that the inevitable, the inherent, the incredibly difficult challenges of dealing with international trade and international negotiations are reduced to some sort of moral confrontation between David and Goliath. It's very misleading. The fourth tactic then, undermining the quality of our national democracy. And I suppose this is, in a way, pre the referendum, this was the cumulative effect of all of the other tactics. But now, post the referendum, we see a very particular strand of this emerging, and it lies in the virtual debasement of our elected parliament, by the very people, of course, who claimed to have fought this campaign in order to protect its sovereignty. And equally, the very obvious attempts by the executive to bolster its own power at the expense of our elected representatives. In fact, something approaching an executive power grab. And for example, let's take the government position on triggering Article 50 of the Treaty on European Union in the first place. The government simply denies any right to parliamentary involvement or parliamentary control over this fundamentally important decision. And only if the courts oblige them to do otherwise will they change their mind. Similarly, the proposals for the Great Repeal Bill. The government promises scrutiny, it promises debate, but it's completely unclear how far the government intends to claim for itself the power to rewrite whole sections of our legal system, or the nature of the parliamentary scrutiny or control that it might envisage. Parliamentary input into the negotiations and the future settlement. The government has reluctantly conceded that there will be some debates in Parliament. It's admitted that it's likely that a deal will require a parliamentary vote. but it remains reluctant to suffer any further parliamentary input or control. And above all, remember what I said before, this conflation of the withdrawal agreement and the future agreement on relations makes it very difficult for us to try and understand what type of rule the government envisages for Parliament, because it's mixing up different agreements, different procedures. Now, overall, the problem is, I suppose, therefore, that ideologues are in the ascendant. And the UK negotiating position is being hijacked, it's being hobbled by these sort of distortions and red lines, concerns about sovereignty and immigration. And this type of sort of ignorance of how important issues work, these fantasies about the prospects for negotiations, the real risk is that they simply fall apart when they're confronted with the external reality of the fact that other people don't believe the same lies that we believe ourselves, they don't swallow the same fantasies that we swallow for ourselves. Now, on the one hand, I think there's a little bit of many of us that might feel that it's tempting to say, well, good, because maybe external reality, maybe the slap across the face of having to walk out into international negotiations and see your strategy fall apart is the only form of accountability which is left. I am probably not of that opinion on balance because of three main reasons. First of all, it tends to be a characteristic of ideologues that they never accept responsibility for the consequences of their own actions. They will always seek to blame other people because they can never be wrong. Secondly, the consequences of their actions are not going to fall on them, they're going to fall upon the country as a whole. And secondly, the consequences are not likely to be short-term. The real consequences of leaving the EU are likely to be in the longer term. In 10 or 20 years' time, we're going to know the real effects of withdrawal. And so the consequences will actually fall on future generations of people, not on those making the decisions now. So I think there's a real worrying imbalance in a way between power and responsibility as we proceed into these negotiations. Now, it's nearly time for me to wrap up with my talk, and I'll do it by addressing an issue which I know many people in this audience, many people across the country would like to discuss. Can it all be stopped? Now, legally, and I'll come back to my main qualification in life, legally, of course, it's possible for the UK not to leave the EU. We might never give notification. We might give notification and then seek to rescind it. The EU, under EU constitutional law, if the UK never delivers notification, then we don't withdraw. If we seek to rescind it, well, there's nothing in the treaties to say that you can't do that. But in a way, whatever the legal position, I think short of a genuinely momentous change in our own national circumstances in the relatively short period, politically it's very difficult to see how the UK is going to change direction. It's very difficult to see that we're not going to leave the EU. And I think that's true for three main reasons. First of all, because a substantial proportion of the UK population will just never accept that outcome. Partly we're talking here about a substantial number of Leave supporters, not all, but a substantial number of Leave supporters who have genuinely been brainwashed or have brainwashed themselves into believing that the EU is worse than Stalinist Russia. And they do believe that. It's a frightening thing when you come across it in person, but there are large numbers of people who do believe that. But equally, there are many people who voted Remain, but who do feel that the vote, whatever its flaws, whatever its consequences, represents a democratic mandate which should not be overturned. The second reason is that to have any legitimacy, seeking to reverse the outcome of this referendum would either require a second referendum or a general election fought on the basis that it was effectively a second referendum. The government has ruled out a second referendum, and under the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, we will already have left the EU by the time we have the next general election. So constitutionally, it's quite difficult to see how the situation might change. And the third reason, the one which I find most striking as I travel around doing my job, is the rapidity with which many of the other member states are simply getting used to the idea that we're leaving. And in fact, we love to hear the phrase from the government, let's make the best of Brexit. Everyone else is now thinking, let's make the best of Brexit too. And that means that there's a momentum not only in the UK behind withdrawal, but there's a momentum within the EU as well. And the longer that goes on, the more difficult it is to arrest. Now, and that's not to deny in the slightest that continuing to argue against the UK's withdrawal still has real political value. not least because it helps keep pressure on the government not to forget that 48% of the people who voted and a great number of the people who weren't entitled to vote did not want this at all. Secondly, because it helps counter the dominant narrative which has been established by the leading Leave campaigners. We should be making the argument, if only so that we leave on better terms, that we get a better deal than the one which their distorted fantasies might otherwise deliver. And thirdly, because who knows, it may well be that there is a genuinely monumental change in our national circumstances. It's not very likely, but it is still a possibility. Nevertheless, the attention, I think, of concerned citizens will not be short of other battles to fight. And those battles will not just be about withdrawal from the EU and the terms of that withdrawal. They won't just be about the prospects for our future relationship with the EU. They won't just be about the future of UK trade policy. Because one of the main lessons, I think, from this whole experience is a reminder of the extraordinary danger of ideology in politics. Our national interest in this matter was not identified through pragmatic, through rational, through evidence-based debate. It was determined by ideological worldviews that were immune to evidence, immune to persuasion, that were totally convinced of their own propaganda, that saw anyone who disagreed with them as an enemy. Now, there's no doubt that the Leave vote in the referendum was a major victory for ideologues. And many people, including many academics, like myself, working at universities up and down the country, worry about their sense of confidence and their sense of ascendancy. Who will be next is the question we often ask while we're at work. Will it be climate change? Will environmental standards be next on the list of populist causes? Will it be medical research that comes under their scrutiny? Will it be the welfare state, or what's left of it, that comes under their scrutiny? Will it be equality legislation for homosexuals? What will be next in their horizons? But I suppose, while ideologues may well feel a sense of sort of self-confidence, we should keep reminding ourselves that that ascendancy is certainly not inevitable, assuming that those of us who do value a more rational, a more honest, perhaps a more tolerant and humane view of our own society are prepared to retake the agenda, to challenge their dominant narrative and retake the agenda. And for me, that's where the real battles lie. Not really in trying to keep the UK in the EU, or at least not only, and not only in trying to get a good deal for the UK, which minimises the economic and political disruption or damage that might flow from withdrawal, but just as importantly, trying to protect the really fundamental values and the fundamental decency of our own country as we prepare for life outside the EU. And so although it may sound a little bit odd, because I've spoken a lot of sort of uncertainty and quite a lot of negative, even depressing messages, but I don't actually think it's a pessimistic message in the end at all. I really see it as a matter of sort of personal and professional responsibility, that we take back the agenda and we insist on a more decent and a more rational basis for the future of our country. Thank you very much for your attention, and look forward to the questions.